Hello everybody. Now, I would like to have a look today at Vicki Feaver's poem The Gun, taken from the Poems of the Decade anthology for Edexcel English Literature A level. Now, this is a poem that really challenges modern day attitudes towards hunting and gun usage. Throughout the poem, we see this symbol of a gun and the initial fear and apprehension attached to it progress and transition to a primitive thrill and ecstasy. As it says here in the poem summary, the speaker's partner brings a shotgun into the house. It is initially described as resting ominously on a table. It is then used for target practice on perforated tins before being used to kill animals. The gun seems to have an electrifying and energizing effect on the house and the relationship between the speaker and her husband. And as the speaker and her partner feast on the animals they have shot, the poem concludes with the speaker comparing this feast to the arrival of a pagan king of death. So it ends with quite a ambivalent and enigmatic image. But really, the key crux of the poem begins at the very start in the opening two lines. Now, before we look at those two lines, I just want to show you Feaver's own words on the poem. So this is just an excerpt from an interview that she gave to the Poetry Archive. And it says here that she lived in Brixton in central London for 20 years. And though I sometimes heard gunshots, I never actually saw a gun. But now living in Lanarkshire, Scotland, right in the middle of the country, I see lots of guns. Almost all of the men seem to have a shotgun. And then my own husband got a shotgun and brought it into the house. And at first I felt very afraid of it. Then gradually my whole attitude changed, as I describe in this poem. So, as I mentioned, this poem positions itself against more modern liberal attitudes towards guns and hunting, which perceive guns solely as dangerous and fearful instruments of death and violence. And throughout this poem, we see a transition from initial fear to a sort of primitive, primal relish and ultimately an acceptance of the gun. And the poem begins with these really two striking lines. Bringing a gun into the house changes it. Now, this opening couplet immediately creates a tension between the gun, which has connotations of violence and death, with the house that has connotations of safety and security. Now, we see this disruptive influence of the gun, and what enters this sort of sanctuary of the home is a potential threat, a means of taking life, an instrument of violence and death. And the line break, which is really quite clever. Watch out for the use of enjambment, run-on lines, line breaks in this poem. That's really a key aspect of its form. The line break suggests that the house has been disrupted by this presence of the gun. Our eyes are drawn through the line break to this verb changes. And this is indeed a poem about change, as I've mentioned already. The movement from a fearful sense of apprehension towards a primitive ecstasy and thrill. And ultimately, in these opening couple of lines, we are left to question, how does it change? How does the house change? In what way does it change? And some of this is explored later in the poem. You lay it on the kitchen table, stretched out like something dead itself, the grainy polished woodstock jutting over the edge, the long barrel casting a grey shadow on the green checked cloth. Now, the imagery in this second stanza continues the sort of tension between the gun and the house. Remember, the gun, instrument of death and violence, and the house, a sanctuary, safety, security. The gun is sort of infused here with a clear sexual symbolism, a phallic symbolism. It's laid on the table by the husband, and it's described as jutting over the edge of the table. So, I mean, this is quite clear sexual symbolism in my perspective that Feaver is using here. And notice, again, the use of contrast. We see the gun casting a grey shadow over the green checked cloth. Something ominous casting a shadow over the very domestic, very homely image of the green checked cloth on the kitchen table. So we can already see that this gun is having this disruptive effect on the domestic setting of the home. And notice also how the gun is already compared to something dead. It says that it's stretched out like something dead itself, which I guess ironically foreshadows the future killing that will occur later in the poem. But at first it's just practice. Perforating tins dangling on orange strings from trees in the garden. Then a rabbit shot clean through the head. Now this third stanza is really important because it shows this sense of escalation. What starts as mere shooting practice on tins ends with the death of a rabbit. Now this final, quite brutal, short sentence at the end of this poem, then a rabbit shot clean through the head. It shows that the addiction to the gun and to the violence develops significantly, and almost like an ethical line is being crossed. As with some of the other poems in this collection, we can class this poem really under the umbrella of transgressive acts that are outside of most people's normal moral boundaries. And the line break here is also really significant, drawing attention clean through the head to the precision of the kill. Soon the fridge fills with creatures that have run and flown. Your hands reek of gun oil and entrails. You trample fur and feathers. There's a spring in your step. Your eyes gleam like when sex was fresh. There is clear use of fricative alliteration. The fridge fills, flown, fur, feathers, which reinforces this sense of excess and creates a sensuousness in this section of the poem, really. And notice how the fridge filling, almost, it does feel like it's seeping out of the edges of the fridge, of all creatures that have run and flown. So now we've got even further than rabbits. We're going to creatures that have been on the ground and ones that fly. So here there is a wider range of animals that are falling victim to the gun, not just rabbits. And as I alluded to earlier, the poem becomes increasingly sensuous in this fourth stanza. Her husband's hands reek of gun oil. Notice that emphasis on the smell. Gun oil and entrails, and he tramples fur and feathers of slaughtered animals into the house. And this point of sensuousness really reaches its crescendo, so to speak, and its culmination in this final line of the stanza, in this quite striking simile, like when sex was fresh, which quite clearly suggests that the gun, in some mystical way, has improved the sex life between the speaker and her partner, and it's kind of seemingly brought an energizing, youthful vitality and virility to their relationship. And this is quite a challenging idea to most, particularly modern readers, but the gun does seem to have an almost revitalizing effect on their relationship and sex life. And then we get this quite emphatic single line stanza, a gun brings a house alive. So the first opening two lines of this poem says that bringing a gun into the house changes it, and we're left to, well, how does it change? Well, now we've got some answers. Their sex life gets a lot better. There's more fur and feathers within the house, and the gun brings their house alive. It revitalizes, re-energizes their home. So what starts off as a quite disruptive influence, there seems to be this growing sense of primitive relish and acceptance of the gun. And you could actually argue that this single line stanza is quite paradoxical. A gun as an instrument of violence and death is ironically bringing their house and their relationship alive. and revitalising it. So just a note on form before I move on to the next stanza. This is from the Edexcel poem commentary. And it picks up here on the use of run-on lines and enjambment. And it says, enjambment, which is the running on of units of sense over two or more lines, also has the effect of shining a small spotlight on those words at the end and start of a line. The gun is full of such examples. So, for example, a rabbit shot clean through the head. Notice how I said that emphasises that the precision of that kill. Your hands reek of gun oil and entrails. You trample fur and feathers. And what it says here is that these line breaks on each of these occasions almost show this division and then encounter between both the human and animal worlds. Notice we've got trample, fur and feathers, shot through the head of the rabbit shot through the head, the gun oil, and then the entrails. The human and the animal worlds are coming into conflict, and this division and this conflict, this tension between the two, is made all the more apparent through Feaver's use of enjambment and line breaks. So, as I mentioned at the start, this poem does position itself against the liberal attitudes towards guns and hunting, which obviously perceive guns solely as a dangerous and fearful instruments of violence and death. Feaver, at least at the start of the poem, seems to be quite hesitant, and her initial response in the first and second stanzas seem to intimate that the gun is disrupting this domestic setting, casting an ominous grey shadow over it, to use her words. But she eventually concludes that the gun has this sort of electrifying and revitalising impact on her relationship. The thrill of the hunt and the pleasure of the subsequent feasting almost become overwhelming. And we see how the gun can bring an intensity and excitement and ultimately a celebration of life, despite or because of life's fragility. I'll pick up on that point in a second in the final stanza. And the poem, really, when we think about, we don't only have to think about the form of a poem, but also the way that it's sequenced, the structure. And it goes along these lines of initial fear and apprehension about the gun, followed by a sort of primitive ecstasy and delightful relish and acceptance of the gun. So, by exploring some of these more primitive aspects, the fur and feathers, the gun oil and entrails, the revitalising effect on their relationship, Feaver sort of prepares the ground for her final stanza of the poem. I join in the cooking, jointing and slicing, stirring and tasting, excited as if the king of death had arrived to feast, stalking out of winter woods, his black mouth sprouting with golden crocuses. Now, as I said, a quite bizarre ending to this poem, but a lot to unpick here. But first of all, we see the speaker of the poem start to become complicit within these killing. We see this. We see syndetic listing here of ing verbs to show how this feast is being prepared, the slicing and stirring and tasting. And just as I mentioned that this poem breaks down some of the contemporary taboos around hunting and valuing the natural world and the animals within it, it also challenges our modern conception of gender roles. The narrator, as I've said, seems complicit in the gun's use, but only in a traditional female role. She is only here to cook what the man has brought home for the feast. And she's quite clear and quite honest in her excitement at the prospect of this feast. She's excited as if the king of death had arrived to feast, stalking out of winter woods. So we get here an image of the pagan figure of the king of death, and he's quite powerfully imagined stalking out of the winter woods to join the feast. And what we see here in this final somewhat ambivalent and enigmatic image of this poem is a weaving of life and death. So this final image of the poem, the king of death coming to the feast, his mouth is described as sprouting golden crocuses. Now, golden crocuses are flowers that are associated with the life of early spring. And really what I think Feaver is getting at here is that hunting and the act of hunting and the gun itself brings the fragility of life more sharply into focus. And the presence of death ultimately makes us cherish life because we recognise its fragility a lot more. The fragility and the transience of life becomes a lot more apparent to us. So this isn't 100% clear, but it is a somewhat incongruous image at the end of this poem that blends life and death. And I think what she's trying to show here is that the gun and the ability of the gun to suddenly take away life brings the fragility of life more sharply into focus, and that this brings about an almost paradoxical celebration of life. So as it says here, again, the presence of death ultimately makes us cherish life, because in death we recognise life's fragility and transience. I hope you've enjoyed this quick run through of the gun, and good luck with the rest of your studying.